I woke up to the sound of engines roaring and metal crunching against the earth. My land, my family's 500-acre farmland that had been in our name for over 2 centuries, was under attack. But this wasn't some foreign invasion, no, it was something far more ridiculous. A bunch of HOA contractors in bright orange vests, operating bulldozers, tearing up my property as if they had every right to do so. I nearly choked on my coffee. I had dealt with the local HOA's nonsense before, but this was a new level of insanity. Sprinting outside in my boots, I saw the worst of it. Fences were flattened, crops were being churned into the dirt, and the vineyard my grandfather had painstakingly built was now nothing but a pile of debris. The worst part? There, standing with her arms crossed like she was overseeing a royal decree, was the woman I had come to know as Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. I stormed up to her, fury boiling in my veins. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" My voice cut through the rumbling machinery, but she barely flinched. Instead, she glanced at me with a smirk that made my fists itch. "Oh, you again," she said, rolling her eyes as if I were an inconvenience in her little empire. "This is an official HOA redevelopment project. You've been delinquent on your dues, so we've had to take action." I blinked. Delinquent? Dues? I wasn't even part of the HOA. "Karen," I growled, barely restraining myself from throwing my coffee at her. "I've told you before. I am not in your HOA. This land isn't in your jurisdiction, it never has been, and it never will be. Get your people off my farm before I call the sheriff." But Karen, in her infinite delusion, merely chuckled. "You really should read the fine print," she said, waving a stack of papers in front of my face as if it were a holy scripture. "Your land falls under the new HOA expansion clause. We sent you multiple notices. Ignoring them was your choice. So now, we're clearing out this unsightly farmland and preparing it for a community park." I could feel my blood pressure hitting dangerous levels. A park? On my land? Without my consent? "Karen, I swear to everything sacred, you've got about 3 seconds to..." Before I could finish my sentence, one of the bulldozers rammed into my equipment shed, sending wood splinters flying in every direction. That was it. I pulled out my phone and started dialing. "Oh, go ahead," Karen said smugly, "but just so you know, eminent domain is a thing. This land is being repurposed for public benefit, and you really have no say in it." That made me freeze. Eminent domain? She was actually trying to invoke government land seizure laws, as if she were some sort of official authority? I had never heard of an HOA president who thought they had the power of the federal government, but Karen, in all her unhinged glory, seemed convinced. "You're out of your damn mind," I muttered, still pressing the call button to the sheriff. My heart pounded as I watched more of my land being torn apart by people who had no right to be there. This wasn't just some petty dispute about property lines or nuisance complaint. This was an outright hostile takeover. And I wasn't about to let it slide. The sheriff arrived faster than I expected, probably because he'd dealt with Karen's antics before. The moment he stepped out of his car, he took one look at the destruction and let out a sigh that spoke of years of dealing with stupid people. "Karen," he said, rubbing his temples, "what have you done this time?" Karen turned to him with a bright smile, as if she hadn't just authorized the destruction of private property. "Oh, Sheriff, I'm so glad you're here. You see, this land has been neglected for far too long, and the HOA board voted to integrate it into our new community plan." The sheriff gave her a deadpan stare before slowly turning to me. "You part of the HOA?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Nope," I replied. "Never have been, never will be." The sheriff sighed again, then looked at the ongoing destruction. "Karen, you do realize that none of this is legal, right?" For the first time, Karen's confidence wavered, but only slightly. Well, eminent domain," she stuttered, gesturing wildly at the torn-up land. "For the good of the people." The sheriff took off his sunglasses and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Karen, eminent domain is a government process. The HOA isn't the government. That was when I saw it, the first flicker of doubt in Karen's eyes. But it didn't last long. Well, that's just a technicality, she scoffed, crossing her arms. The board has made its decision. I could barely believe the sheer arrogance. The board? I said, laughing bitterly. You mean your little band of wannabe dictators? Karen's face turned red. You watch yourself, she snapped. This is happening whether you like it or not. I stared at her for a long moment, then at the destruction around me. Then I smirked. All right, I said. We'll see about that. Because what Karen didn't know, what she was about to find out the hard way, was that she had just dug herself into the biggest legal nightmare of her life. And I was going to make sure she regretted it. I didn't waste a second. The moment Karen and her goons saw the sheriff wasn't immediately siding with them, they doubled down on their nonsense, trying to convince him that the HOA had absolute authority over my land. Meanwhile, I was already on the phone with my lawyer, barely restraining the urge to start flipping over tables, or in this case, bulldozers. My lawyer, a no-nonsense guy who had seen just about every ridiculous property dispute imaginable, barely let me finish my sentence before cutting in with, "They did what? They think HOA rules override actual property law? Alright, sit tight, I'm on my way." The moment I hung up, I could see Karen trying to sweet-talk the sheriff, all while pretending the destruction of my land was just a minor landscaping project. She kept waving around some fabricated HOA documents, trying to make it seem like she had legal backing, but even the sheriff wasn't buying it. "Karen," he said flatly, "you can't just claim someone else's land because you think it looks better under HOA control. That's not how this works." But Karen, in true Karen fashion, refused to listen. "Sheriff, I don't think you understand. This community is thriving, and this land has been nothing but an eyesore for years. We're improving the value of the neighborhood by integrating it into our plans." I almost laughed. My farm, the very land that had been producing high-quality crops, a vineyard and livestock for generations, was somehow an eyesore? The absurdity of it was enough to make my eye twitch. "This land isn't in your HOA," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "It never was. And you just bulldozed private property. You realize that's a felony, right?" Karen waved me off like I was some annoying fly buzzing around her head. "It's not private if the community needs it," she said smugly. "I sent you notices and you ignored them. That's on you." The sheriff let out a slow, deliberate sigh and looked at me. "You pressing charges?" he asked, as if the answer wasn't obvious. "Oh, you better believe it," I said. Karen's smirk faltered for a brief second before she squared her shoulders. "Well, then I'll press charges right back," she huffed. For trespassing." I stared at her, trying to figure out if she had completely lost her mind or if she had been born without any critical thinking skills. "Trespassing? On my own land?" The sheriff gave her a look that could only be described as exhausted disbelief. "Karen, that's not how any of this works." But Karen wasn't done making a fool of herself. "I'll have my lawyers take care of this," she snapped, then turned back to the bulldozer crew. "Keep going. I don't care what they say." And just like that, she effectively sealed her fate. The sheriff immediately pulled out his radio, calling in backup, while I watched with barely contained rage as the crew hesitated, clearly unsure if they should continue demolishing property now that law enforcement was involved. Karen, in her infinite arrogance, stomped her foot like a toddler throwing a tantrum. "I don't answer to you. I answer to the HOA board, and they approved this project. You can't stop progress." By the time my lawyer arrived, 2 more patrol cars had shown up, and the scene had turned into a full-blown standoff. The bulldozer operators had finally shut off their engines, clearly realizing that no paycheck was worth getting arrested for, but Karen was still convinced she was untouchable. That delusion didn't last long. My lawyer wasted no time ripping into her, demanding to see the supposed documents she kept waving around like a golden ticket. And, as expected, the moment he actually read them, he let out a dry chuckle. "Karen," he said, shaking his head, You do realize that these aren't even real legal documents, right? This is literally just an HOA newsletter with a bunch of self-imposed rules you have no authority to enforce. Karen's face went pale for just a second before she quickly regained her usual indignant expression. Well, the intent is the same, she snapped. It was only a matter of time before this land was properly integrated into the HOA, so why delay the inevitable? My lawyer turned to the sheriff. She just admitted to attempting an illegal land seizure, he said flatly. That, along with property destruction, is more than enough for an arrest. The sheriff nodded, finally pulling out his handcuffs, but before he could even move, Karen suddenly shrieked, "You can't arrest me! I'm on the HOA board!" As if that was some kind of magical immunity. The moment those cuffs clicked around her wrists, reality finally seemed to hit her. "This is harassment," she screeched. "This is oppression. I'm the victim here." The sheriff just sighed, guiding her toward the patrol car as she kicked and screamed. Meanwhile, my lawyer turned to me, already flipping open his notepad. "We're going to sue the hell out of them," he said. "Property damage, trespassing, illegal seizure, fraud, this is going to be fun." But even as Karen was driven away, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA wasn't just one person, and I had a gut feeling they weren't going to let this go without a fight. What I didn't know was just how much worse things were about to get. I thought Karen's arrest would be the end of it. I thought that, maybe for once, common sense and the law would win without further complications. But I had severely underestimated the level of corruption and entitlement running through this HOA. Barely 24 hours after Karen had been hauled off in handcuffs, I woke up to a barrage of emails, letters, and voicemails from various so-called officials representing the HOA board. Every single one of them was dripping with fake concern and passive-aggressive threats disguised as legal jargon. Apparently, Karen's little stunt had put them in a tight spot, and instead of cutting their losses and admitting they had no authority over my land, they decided to double down. The messages varied in tone, from condescending to outright hostile, but the underlying message was clear. If I didn't drop my legal action and allow them to proceed with their development plans, I would regret it. Some emails even hinted at legal retaliation, claiming they had evidence that I had violated multiple zoning laws and would be facing severe financial consequences if I pursued my case. I couldn't help but laugh at the sheer audacity of it all. They had literally bulldozed my property, destroyed my crops, and committed outright fraud, yet they had the nerve to act as if I was the one in the wrong. I sent every single message to my lawyer, who by now was having an absolute field day with how many violations and threats they had documented against themselves. He simply responded with, "Oh, this just keeps getting better. They're digging their own grave at this point." But the HOA wasn't just relying on legal scare tactics. The very next morning, a so-called inspector from the HOA showed up at my farm, clipboard in hand, trying to pretend he had any authority over my land. He was a lanky man with oversized glasses and an expression that told me he had never worked a day outside in his life. He barely even looked me in the eye before saying, "Sir, I'm here to conduct a property assessment to ensure your farm meets HOA safety and aesthetic standards." I stared at him, waiting for him to realize just how ridiculous he sounded. "You realize I'm not part of your HOA, right?" I said, crossing my arms. He gave a tight-lipped smile, flipping through his clipboard. "Well, you see, there's been an administrative review, and due to recent changes in the community bylaws, this land now falls under extended HOA jurisdiction." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. They were just making things up now. "Oh really?" I said, playing along. "And what exactly do your extended bylaws say about farmers who want nothing to do with your organization?" He adjusted his glasses, clearly flustered, and mumbled, "Well, failure to comply with HOA inspections can result in escalating fines and eventual property seizure." That was it. That was the moment I lost it. I laughed so hard I nearly doubled over. "Let me get this straight," I said between chuckles. Your little HOA is going to fine me for not following rules I never agreed to, and then you're going to take my land? Even after your president got arrested for trying the same thing? His face went red and he shuffled his feet. I'm just following orders, he stammered. Right, I said, shaking my head. Well, here's my order. Get off my land before I call the sheriff again. He hesitated for a moment before quickly turning on his heel and marching back to his car. But I wasn't an idiot. I knew this wasn't the last I'd see of them. And sure enough, that night the real retaliation began. At exactly 2 a.m, my security alarms went off. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my shotgun, and ran outside to find several figures creeping around my property line with flashlights. I didn't even need to guess who they were. HOA members, desperate and stupid, trying to intimidate me into backing off. I flipped on the floodlights, and as soon as they realized they'd been caught, they scattered like roaches. But one of them, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline and a terrible attempt at a sneaky jog, wasn't fast enough. I caught him right before he could slip through the tree line. And where do you think you're going? I asked, tightening my grip on my shotgun. He stammered something about checking property boundaries and making sure there were no encroachments. I rolled my eyes. Yeah? How about we let the sheriff decide that? I dragged him back toward the house, calling law enforcement yet again. By the time the sheriff arrived, the rest of the HOA cowards had disappeared, but I had one of their board members dead to rights trespassing on my land in the middle of the night. The sheriff looked exhausted, rubbing his face before shaking his head. You've got to be kidding me, he muttered, staring at the idiot I had caught. You people never learn, do you? I didn't think it was possible, but this was turning into something even bigger than I expected. Karen's arrest had barely made a dent in the HOA's arrogance, and now they were resorting to intimidation and late-night trespassing. But they had underestimated me. This wasn't just about my land anymore. It was about setting a precedent. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. I had a plan that was going to destroy every last one of them. They had no idea what was coming next. I had reached my limit. After everything the HOA had pulled, the destruction of my property, the fake legal threats, the bogus inspections, and now literal trespassing in the middle of the night, it was clear they weren't going to stop until they either stole my land or ran themselves into the ground. Lucky for me, I was going to make sure it was the latter. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told him to go full throttle with the lawsuit. I wasn't just suing for property damage anymore. Oh no, we were going after every single legal violation they had committed, from fraud to harassment to destruction of property. I wanted them not just punished but utterly obliterated, and my lawyer was more than happy to oblige. While he got to work compiling the lawsuit, I decided to launch my own counterattack. If the HOA wanted a war, then they were going to get one. First, I called every local news station I could find, sending them pictures and videos of the destruction on my land, along with recordings of HOA threats and a statement about how a rogue homeowners association was illegally trying to seize farmland that had been in my family for generations. It didn't take long for reporters to start sniffing around, and once they caught wind that the HOA president had already been arrested, they jumped on the story like piranhas. Within hours, the local news was running headlines about corrupt HOAs abusing power, and my phone was blowing up with interview requests. But I wasn't done. Oh no, the HOA had underestimated just how petty I could be. With a little digging, I found out that their entire development had multiple unapproved modifications that technically violated the very HOA rules they enforced on everyone else. Driveways too wide, fences too tall, sheds built without permits, you name it. So, I did what any rational person would do and reported every single violation to the city's zoning department. If they wanted to weaponize bureaucracy against me, I was more than happy to return the favor. By the time the city officials were done reviewing the complaints, nearly half the HOA members had fines slapped on their properties, and several of them were facing mandatory demolitions to bring their homes back into compliance. And just like that, their little kingdom started crumbling. But the real nail in the coffin came when the lawsuit was officially filed, and my lawyer got a court order freezing all HOA assets until the case was resolved. That meant they couldn't use a single dime from their HOA dues to fight the lawsuit, which put them in an impossible position. If they wanted to defend themselves, they'd have to pay out of pocket, and let's just say that the average HOA board member wasn't exactly rolling in cash. Panic spread like wildfire through their ranks, and within days, resignations started rolling in. The members who had blindly supported Karen and her cronies were suddenly realizing that they were about to be financially ruined just for going along with her delusions. The HOA board, once so smug and self-important, was now scrambling to hold emergency meetings, begging members for more money to cover legal fees, but no one was willing to throw their hard-earned cash into a sinking ship. The remaining board members started turning on each other, with some trying to cut deals with my lawyer to testify against Karen in exchange for reduced penalties. It was a full-blown collapse, and I was there to enjoy every second of it. Then, as if the universe wanted to throw one final punch at the HOA, an audit was conducted on their finances, and surprise, surprise, it turned out that the entire HOA budget had been mismanaged for years. Thousands of dollars in member dues were unaccounted for, and where did they go? Straight into an offshore account under Karen's name. The moment that little detail came to light, the case against them stopped being just about my land. Now it was a full-on criminal investigation. Karen, who had somehow managed to post bail after her first arrest, was hauled back into custody for fraud and embezzlement, and this time, there was no getting out of it. The rest of the HOA board members weren't far behind, facing charges ranging from conspiracy to falsifying documents. The entire HOA was officially disbanded, their assets liquidated to pay off the damages, and every homeowner in their development was suddenly free from the tyranny they had once feared. My lawsuit was settled in my favor, with the court awarding me more than enough money to not only repair my land but expand my farm. The day the final ruling came in, I walked back onto my property, taking in the sight of my land finally free from the grip of those power-hungry lunatics. The vineyard was already being restored, new crops were being planted, and the fences were being rebuilt stronger than before. I knew it would take time to fully recover from the damage, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. I had won. They had tried to take everything from me, but in the end, all they had managed to do was destroy themselves. As I stood there, watching the sun set over my fields, my phone buzzed with another news notification. One last article about the downfall of the HOA and Karen's upcoming sentencing. I smirked and put my phone away. I didn't need to read it. I already knew how the story ended.